After more than a decade of dominance in Scottish politics, the Scottish National Party continues to decline in the polls and has now fallen behind the Labour Party in Scotland. The latest forecast from Britain Elect suggests that a resurgent Labour Party would take a majority of Scottish Westminster seats, while the SNP would lose more than half of its seats. On top of this, with party splits, an ongoing police finance probe, and other difficulties, SNP leader and Scotland's First Minister Humza Yousaf is increasingly unpopular and untrusted. So where does all of this leave the Scottish independence movement? In this video, we'll explain the history of the movement, its current state, and explore whether or not Scottish independence is dead. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To make a fair assessment of the Scottish independence movement's future, we need to take a look at and understand its past. When, why, and how did it become a political force, and what was behind its peaks and falls over the years? The modern independence movement, spearheaded by the Scottish National Party, rose to political prominence in the 1960s and 70s. As a range of factors, including deindustrialisation and economic difficulty at home, and a wave of decolonisation abroad, galvanised demands for self-rule. The SNP won a historic by-election victory in Hamilton in 1967, beginning a continuous and ongoing presence in the UK Parliament. The 1970s then saw significant political success for the SNP, propelled by the discovery of oil in the North Sea in 1970, and the SNP's subsequent It's Scotland's Oil campaign, which helped form their economic case for independence. The two elections in 1974 saw the SNP rise from just one seat to 11, and in the October vote, the party received more than 30% of the vote in Scotland. This all added momentum to the push for devolved powers for Scotland, and the same was happening in Wales at the time too, although that's a different story. The Labour government in the late 1970s introduced legislation to establish a devolved Scottish Assembly, but required the plans to be approved by 40% of the Scottish electorate. In the March 1979 referendum, nearly 52% of voters said yes, but due to the turnout, this represented just 33% of the registered electorate, meaning that the plans had to be killed. Just weeks later, James Callaghan's Labour government was toppled by a vote of no confidence, backed by the SNP among others, that succeeded by just one vote. The subsequent election, held just over a month later, would bring Margaret Thatcher and the Conservative Party to power. And in that election, the SNP suffered a significant setback, losing 9 of its 11 Westminster seats and nearly half of its vote share. However, the delivery of Margaret Thatcher to number 10 would end up galvanising the Scottish nationalist movement in the long run, due to her staunch unionism and, to put it simply, difficult relationship with Scotland, exemplified by the introduction of the unpopular poll tax in Scotland before the rest of Great Britain. In fact, polling from Ipsos Mori shows support for Scottish independence rising from 14% in 1979 to 40% in 1991. One of the key themes of this period was the political divergence between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Because while the country as a whole returned the Conservatives to power for 18 years, Scotland consistently over that same period elected Labour MPs to the majority of Scottish seats. This dynamic of a more left-wing and progressive Scotland versus a Conservative government in Westminster, not supported by Scottish voters, was important to the growth of Scottish nationalist sentiment, and is a dynamic that would repeat itself a decade later in the 2010s. While Scottish devolution had been off the cards during the 18 years of Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher and John Major, it returned to the agenda when Tony Blair's Labour Party was swept into power in 1997. In fact, Labour had endorsed the creation of a Scottish Parliament in its election manifesto, and a referendum on the proposal held later that year saw nearly 75% of voters approve the plans. Then the opening of the Scottish Parliament in 1999 appeared to help limit the appeal of Scottish independence, and in the decade or so following its opening, support for independence stayed within the 20s or 30s. But those who thought that devolution would kill Scottish nationalism stone dead were proven dramatically wrong when in 2011 the SNP under Alex Salmond won the Scottish Parliament's first ever majority with 69 of the 129 seats. Now, this can be attributed to a number of factors. Firstly, voters were generally satisfied with the performance of the SNP's minority government that had run Scotland since 2007. Labour had also lost ground after an ineffective election campaign, and the Liberal Democrats in particular were punished by Scottish voters unhappy with the party entering into coalition with the Conservatives a year earlier. The 2011 Scottish parliamentary election, while delivering a major victory for the SNP, did not coincide with a surge in support for Scottish independence though, which sat at around a third. Nonetheless, the UK government under David Cameron accepted that the SNP's majority in Scotland was a mandate for a referendum on independence, and in 2012, the Edinburgh Agreement was struck, providing for such a referendum to be held in September 2014. Now, as you know, the pro-independence camp lost the 2014 referendum by 45 to 55%, but that was far from the end of the Scottish independence movement. Instead, it raised the salience of independence as an issue and strengthened the pro-independence bloc. The following year, at the 2015 general election, the SNP won a massive victory, winning 56 of the 59 Scottish seats in the UK Parliament. The post-2015 period in British politics was perhaps the most dramatic and tumultuous in a generation, and saw a series of events and factors that kept the Scottish independence movement alive and kicking. The UK's vote to leave and subsequent withdrawal from the European Union highlighted the stark divide between the Scottish polity and the rest of the country. Scotland, which voted 62% in favour of Remain, was being taken out of the EU by a Conservative government. And from 2019, that government was led by Boris Johnson, a man deeply unpopular in Scotland. On top of this, the early stage of the COVID pandemic ushered in a period of strength for the independence movement. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, appearing almost daily at live COVID briefings, was perhaps seen as assuming something of a prime ministerial role. Scotland was a more visibly distinct political entity, crafting its own response to the pandemic, which could be compared to the strategy drawn up in London. All of these things may have contributed to voters increasingly seeing independence as a viable option. According to Professor Sir John Curtis, every published opinion poll on independence conducted between June 2020 and January 2021 had yes ahead of no, the first time ever that polling had consistently put independence ahead. So, given all of these factors, more than a decade of unpopular Conservative government, Remain voting Scotland being taken out of the EU, and the seemingly reinvigorated independence movement, the early 2020s could have been seen by some as the beginning of Scotland's march towards inevitable independence. But just a couple of years later, things look very different. So, what's happened? The first thing we're going to look at to explain the current state of affairs is the apparent collapse of the SNP. Now, it's worth pointing out that the SNP alone is not the pro-independence movement in Scotland. But as the predominant pro-independence party, the fate of the movement, at least for now, is closely tied to that of the SNP. And many of the problems facing the SNP have been brewing for some time now. But in the immediate term, it was Nicola Sturgeon's surprise resignation as party leader and Scottish First Minister in February 2023 that seemed to precipitate the party's ongoing fall from grace. The leadership election that followed exposed ideological divisions within the SNP that Sturgeon had largely managed to keep a lid on. Issues like gay marriage, trans rights, and the SNP's independence strategy became hot topics as the candidates grappled with their competing ideals. Also damaging to the SNP is the ongoing police probe into its finances, which dramatically escalated with the arrest and questioning of Nicola Sturgeon and other SNP figures a few months after she left office. Which brings us to another reason why Scottish independence might be dead, at least for now. And that's the high likelihood of a Labour government forming after this year's election. Labour is not just resurgent in England, it's also on the rise in Scotland at the expense of the SNP. If, as some of the most recent polling suggests, Labour wins in Scotland, this would end one of the key dynamics driving pro-independent sentiment. And that's because there would no longer be a Tory government in Westminster at odds with a Scotland overwhelmingly electing SNP MPs. Instead, Scotland would get a government it voted for, a Labour one. Labour leader Keir Starmer, like Blair before him, may also be able to placate what could be called soft independence supporters by offering greater devolution to Scotland or stronger representation in Westminster. For example, with plans for a Senate of Nations and Regions. But perhaps the most obvious obstacle to Scottish independence is the fact that any legal independence referendum has to be granted by the UK government. This principle was confirmed by the Supreme Court in November 2022, when it rejected the SNP's argument that the Scottish government alone could hold a referendum. And the prospect of either a Labour or Tory-led UK government granting another Scottish independence referendum looks vanishingly small, with there being virtually no appetite in Westminster to gamble with another major constitutional referendum following Brexit. Plus, with the SNP's poll numbers in decline, winning enough votes and seats to claim a mandate for demanding another referendum also looks difficult. So it appears that, at least for now, Scottish independence is pretty dead. But it would be foolish to write off the independence movement for good, so perhaps dormant is a better term than dead. After all, history shows that the movement has had its ups and downs. The impact on pro-independent sentiment of any further devolution granted by the next Labour government may only be temporary, as was the case under Tony Blair. The decline of the SNP does mean that voters have been turned off by the party, but it doesn't mean that they've necessarily stopped supporting independence as a long-term goal. For example, support for Scottish independence has fluctuated since the 2014 referendum, but has not dipped below the low to mid-40s. Even now, as the SNP fall in the polls, support for independence hasn't dropped in the same way. In fact, the poll cited at the start of this video, which puts Labour ahead of the SNP, shows the yes to independence side trailing no by just 1 point. In any case, it's not impossible to imagine a situation in the future where the same dynamics that bolstered the previous waves of the independence movement reappear. But whether that leads to independence or ends in failure is a whole nother question. So let us know what you think in the comments below. Geopolitics and national security issues definitely seem to be getting more difficult right now, as we regularly cover in our videos. But when it comes to your personal security, that's never been easier, thanks to our sponsor, NordVPN. That's because NordVPN offers you one-click protection, with their threat protection service shielding you from malware, trackers, and ads, especially when you're on dodgy public Wi-Fi networks. Not only that, but their dark web monitoring service actively notifies you if someone leaks your credentials, helping you stay one step ahead. All this protection doesn't have to come at the expense of great connection though, with NordVPN offering the very fastest service of any VPN, allowing you to connect almost instantly anywhere in the world. Throw in their 24/7 customer service, dedicated apps on all major platforms, one account protecting 6 devices, and 30-day money-back guarantee, it's hard to come up with any reasons not to sign up. Plus, if you sign up for a 2-year plan using our link, you not only get a massive discount, you also get 4 extra months totally free. So if you want to sign up for NordVPN and also help improve our journalism, then make sure you click our link in the description. That way you'll get their great service for a discount and let them know that you came through us. Thank you.